On to our next high Renaissance superstar. Michelangelo lived to a ripe old age, and as a result, he complicates our planning, since his later work really belongs to the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or reaction to the Protestant Reformation. So, I'll return to his dark Last Judgment when we get to mannerism in Unit 9. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo was an artist who normed his times. Indeed, he's the first Western artist whose biography was published while he was still alive. He was also the first artist whose art made him, in modern terms, a multimillionaire. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo's roots lie in the early Renaissance, and more specifically, also in the Florence of Lorenzo de' Medici. He was born in a town near Florence and apprenticed to Ghirlandaio. Remember that other Last Supper that we just saw? Lorenzo de' Medici recognized his talent, invited him to join the art academy that Cosimo had founded, the first permanent painting school in history, and even invited him to live in the Medici palace. When Savonarola's followers succeeded in banishing the Medici from Florence, Michelangelo traveled to Venice, Bologna, and finally to Rome, where he arrived at the age of 21 and would work for most of his life. So this is a good point to pause in my biography to talk a little more about the Eternal City's revival. During the medieval period, Rome was a one-industry town. The industry was the church, and most of the consumers were pilgrims. When the popes decamped to Avignon during much of the 14th century, Rome went into a steep decline. When the papacy returned permanently to Rome in the 15th century, a series of strong, if not especially spiritual popes, led a drive to rebuild the city and especially its religious buildings. These popes were heavily influenced by the Renaissance and also helped shape the emerging Rome-centered high Renaissance Rome. The pope we will most concern ourselves with this class and next is Julius II, who was pope from 1503 to 1513. He took this name to show his admiration of Julius Caesar, not a notable Christian saint. The drive to beautify and glorify Rome would acquire new urgency when Martin Luther began to challenge the church's authority, although ironically the crisis that provoked the Protestant Reformation was German objections to papal efforts to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's by selling indulgences. Stay tuned. The College Board did not include any Michelangelo sculptures on its list, but Michelangelo himself preferred sculpture to painting, and as we'll see, his Sistine Chapel paintings, our required works, sometimes look a lot like his sculptures. This Pietà is my personal favorite and the only work that Michelangelo actually signed. It was this sculpture that catapulted Michelangelo to fame and attracted the interest of Julius II. Michelangelo returned to Florence, where he produced his iconic David. This statue is 16.5 feet tall without the base. Like the Pietà, the David was immediately hailed as a masterpiece. In fact, the cathedral authorities convened a committee that included Botticelli, Filippino Lippi, the naughty angel in the painting, remember, and Leonardo da Vinci to decide where the statue should be placed. Allegedly, Leonardo wanted to put it in an obscure corner. He was apparently jealous of Michelangelo, who in turn, probably not entirely unfairly, being able to finish any of his great ideas. Leonardo lost the argument, and the committee ultimately chose a spot beside the main entrance to the Piazza della Signoria, or Town Hall, where it stood until 1873, when it was removed to a museum for safekeeping. Michelangelo's David is not on the list, but it shows up in several College Board practice questions, so go figure. Michelangelo would have been very famous with Donatello's work, which had been produced 60 years earlier. So how has he departed from Donatello's vision? Well, Michelangelo's David is much larger, really colossal in size. Both Davids are nude, but Michelangelo's sculpture did not provoke the same unease as Botticelli's. That may partly be because Florentines had grown accustomed to nude statues, but it also seems to me that Michelangelo's David has none of the disturbing pedophiliac undertones of Donatello's work. Although the stance is superficially similar, Michelangelo has chosen a very different moment in the narrative. Not the moment of victory, but the moment when David winds up to fire his slingshot. Note how one side of his body remains closed and relaxed, but the other is poised, tensed, and ready to spring. The body stands in a resilient curve, like a strung bowstring. The hands and feet are oversized, which renders them both more protective and more expressive. Remember, too, that the statue was designed to be seen from below, and Michelangelo designed his David to focus our eyes on the two elements of his victory, the head that came up with the plan and the hand that executed the plan. A brilliant brain directing a fit and agile body, the Renaissance ideal, and we're going to see it in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel paintings as well. Which brings us to the great drama of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo left behind a detailed autobiography, so we have a blow-by-blow account of his love-hate relationship with his most famous patron, Julius II, told, of course, from Michelangelo's somewhat self-serving perspective. This video clip introduces the famous partnership and feud. The video starts up, by the way, after Julius II had canceled Michelangelo's contract to design his tomb, and Michelangelo had run off to Florence with much of the Pope's money. The Sistine Chapel is the private chapel of the Pope, located between the papal apartments and the Basilica of St. Peter's. It is here that the College of Cardinals meets to elect a new pope. The chapel was built by Pope Sixtus IV, hence the term Sistine, in the late 15th century, but the original ceiling was simply blue with stars. The lower walls were decorated by a series of mostly Florentine artists. The end wall, which we see here, the Last Judgment, was also painted by Michelangelo, but not until the period between 1535 and 1541. We will discuss that work in more detail when we get to Manner's art. Walking toward the altar, one passes from the life of Noah to the life of Adam to the creation of the world, a reverse sequence from the chronological one. The priest standing at the altar would, of course, see it in the right direction, but upside down. Either way, this compositional plan ensured the expulsion from the garden falls directly above the gate that separated the laity and the priest sections of the chapel. The creation falls directly above the altar. On the curved sides, in those triangles, Michelangelo painted Sibyls, prophets, and the ancestors of Christ. Everything that looks like architecture is an illusion, by the way. It is all painting. Michelangelo was terrified by the commission. He hadn't worked in fresco since he trained as a teenage apprentice 20 years earlier. The Pope, moreover, had suggested that he paint scenes from the New Testament. Michelangelo thought the Pope's plans lacked drama. He persuaded Julius II to cover the ceiling with Old Testament narratives instead, from creation through the flood and Noah's Ark. The technical challenges were enormous. Painting on wet plaster required an artist to work quickly and accurately. It was difficult to gain a good sense of perspective working on a ceiling, although, contrary to legend, Michelangelo stood rather than lay on his scaffolding. His diaries report 4 years of constant back pain. The next video clip talks about problems Michelangelo ran into producing his first panel, the Flood, which, as it happens, is the panel the College Board chose as its required work. So I admit I'm puzzled by the College Board's decision to choose this as the one required Genesis panel. As you just saw, the Flood was the first panel that Michelangelo painted, but art historians pretty much agree that it was also Michelangelo's worst panel. So what's the problem with the composition? Mostly, it was just too busy and too hard to see way up on the ceiling. Let's compare it for a moment with the creation of Adam, which is widely viewed as the masterpiece among the Genesis panels. So what differences do you observe? Well, the creation panel is much simpler, but it's also more dynamic. The figures are large enough that we can make out facial expression as well as the beautifully modeled musculature. Somehow the creation panel also seems to capture the Renaissance enterprise. Humans empowered to think, to create, and of course to sin and fall. God is the instrument, but man is God's creation and in some ways his partner as well. Here again, as with David, Michelangelo is all about the action that is about to happen and our anticipation that Adam's new life will emerge in the next moment. In the Flood panel, the male nudes or ignudi on the frame below the Flood almost overpower the biblical story. They too easily draw the eye. But now that I've seized an opportunity to diss Michelangelo, let's try to see some of the strengths of this work. Here again we detect Michelangelo's humanist agenda. He has not portrayed the soon-to-be drowned people as evil caricatures. These are real people, pleading for help, assisting each other, seeking shelter, and hoping somehow for rescue. Here we see a mother cradling a baby and trying to protect her child from the rain. a man carrying his wife he hopes to safety, a boy climbing a tree. But of course, the only hope lies with that odd, boxy arc at the back of the painting. So what is going to happen to the people raising a ladder to get in? Are they members of Noah's family? Will the ladder be pushed back as the ark sails? There's a lot of drama here. Our second required image from the Sistine Chapel is one of the Sibyls, which Michelangelo placed alongside the prophets because these Greek mythological seers were thought to have foretold the birth of Christ. Again, we see the marriage of classical and Christian themes that is so characteristic of Michelangelo and the High Renaissance. The Delphic Sibyl is the youngest and most beautiful of the Sibyls. She presided over the temple of Apollo in the Greek town of Delphi, where it was long customary for the priestess, or Pythia as she was called, to be a young woman selected from some family of poor country people. The Sibyl is carefully, really sculpturally composed. To achieve balance in space, Michelangelo makes the Sibyl turn her limbs in one direction and the face and gaze in a countering direction. While her lower body is mostly static, her upper body twists in a broad, sweeping, arching motion, echoed by the open stroll and the swollen cloak. Michelangelo uses strong color contrast to draw our eye toward her twisting shoulder, while chiaroscuro and trompe d'oeil architectural features enhance the sense of volume. Presumably, the prophetic scroll she's reading predicts the coming of Christ. So, why doesn't she look happier about this? I don't know. Maybe it's because the reign of Apollo was coming to an end. However, there are other pictures of the same Sibyl carrying a crown of thorns, showing that she predicted the suffering of Christ. So perhaps this is the meaning of the sorrowful expression in those wide eyes. So what do you notice about Michelangelo's women? Looks a little like they're trying out for women's pro wrestling, doesn't it? Or maybe ingesting some controlled substances? Really, all of Michelangelo's figures look a little like statues, and he used male models for both men and women. Just FYI, this is one of the works you might end up writing your test essay about. I'll tell you about the other possibilities in my test review podcast, and Moodle's randomizer will make the choice. Okay.